So now you took us through some of the office stuff, but what happens when you have to go to job sites? What does a typical day look like when you're out there doing your checks in the field?
Typically, if I'm planning to go to a job site, we'll schedule it with the owner or the general contractor and plan to meet at a job site at a certain time. So we can walk through, the three kind of main parties of most projects are going to be the owner, the architect, and the general contractor. So we'll plan to meet on the job site and kind of walk through. So the general contractor will be kind of catching us up as far as what's going on, if there are any concerns or any issues. I'm there as an architect to take my own notes and observe. I'll be taking pictures on my phone and taking notes in a notebook, and anything that's not built as it was drawn or anything that doesn't look like it's coming together right, I'll take a note of it and, discuss that. Typically, they're pretty small things. There was a project that I was working on a while ago. It was a big, complex commercial project. One of the big recurring issues was the waterproofing. There were so many different parts and pieces of this project, several different materials that kind of came together at different points in the project. We wanted to make sure the waterproofing, I was on a snowy, high altitude site up in the mountains. And so we wanted to make sure that we were going to keep the water out of the structure. So we kind of kept catching things that weren't waterproofed correctly and could potentially have caused problems. So we had a couple of different types of waterproofing. We had like a foundation waterproofing, which was rolled on or spray applied. It's like this black tar stuff. And then we have different waterproofing tape. They kind of go down and seal joints. In this case, we had to make sure that it was taped properly between the stud walls and the concrete foundation so that we weren't going to have water being driven in underneath that stud wall and on top of the concrete footing. And we just kept having issues there.
Do you ever have any cases where the contractor, their team just keep making bad mistakes or something? Or is it usually where you're like, okay, we caught it, now the guys are going to do it the right way?
We definitely try to build good relationships with the contractors that we work with, and we try to recommend contractors that we trust to our clients, but we don't always have that control. So, there have been issues in the past where a contractor doesn't want to take direction from an architect because, they're the ones leading the job site. They've been constructing buildings for decades. There can be kind of an ego thing there. But for the most part, a lot of the people we work with are great and they take pride in their work.
And how long do your walkthroughs typically take when you're on the job site?
Yeah, it depends. For a big commercial complex project, they can be half a day or, one of the biggest projects I worked on last year. That one, you spend all day. And it also was, not really local. So, typically it's an hour, 2 hours, maybe at the most. It depends. Sometimes we kind of also have a meeting or meetings with the, owner, contractor. Other times it's just like a quick walkthrough. If it's a local project, just stop by for, 15, 20 minutes, just enough to see where everything's at. And it depends too on where the project's at in construction. If you're just looking at, foundation, a hole in the ground with some concrete forms or some recently poured, foundations, then it's pretty straightforward. But once as the project progresses and you have your framings up and the project's starting to be dried in and you have, kind of electrical being run and plumbing going in, there's a lot to take in. Ultimately, it is the general contractor's job to make sure things are done according to the documents. But as an architect, I'm kind of acting as kind of the owner's advocate. There's no way I'm going to catch everything, that could possibly go wrong.
Now, do you just go to the job site and kind of look around and just look at stuff visually? Or do you whip out a tape measure or something and check and make sure things are, where they should be?
Yeah, mostly it's just visual, unless something looks really off. If something's really off, then you kind of tell that, you kind of see and sense that without even a tape measure.
And if you see anything, you said you take a picture and stuff and you document it. What do you do? Throw it in a PowerPoint and then send it to the contractor and the owner? Or?
Yeah, so I'll document it. So I kind of have these official forms, these kind of field notes forms. So I'll kind of package it in just a PDF. Some notes and some photos. Really, I'm sending it to the owner. The way contracts are set up is an owner hires an architect and an owner hires a contractor. So while I'm collaborating with contractors quite often, I don't actually have any contractual kind of relationship with the contractor. So I'm directing everything to the owner and the contractor's doing the same.
In a bigger company, will you have as much interaction as you currently do in a smaller company, or do people typically just get assigned work from their boss and there's not much customer interaction?
Yeah, in a bigger company, my experience has been that, you're typically taking direction from either a principal or a project architect. It's more hierarchical, and you're not likely to get much client interaction. It's not always the case, but there's definitely, my experience working for bigger companies has been you are much less likely to be at client meetings and be interacting with like the other project stakeholders, like a contractor or an owner or other consultants. You're going to be just taking direction from, whoever's above you, basically. Whereas at a smaller firm, there tend to be more opportunities to be involved in other parts of the design process.
Let's say you had a project in a new area or state, like somewhere that you've never worked. How would you find out if there's any sort of special building code that like differed from the norm? Because you had said that there was like this general building code that's, kind of universal, but how would you find out if an area had things that were out of the norm?
Yeah, so that's actually an important part of what I do. And it's something that a lot of homeowners, a lot of people who haven't worked with an architect before don't realize that one thing you kind of specialize in as an architect is navigating building departments and building codes. Typically, when I'm working in a new area, I'll try to make an introduction with the building department, reach out to them. You can typically find this stuff online. So on the building department website, they should say which building codes they're using, because some jurisdictions are going to be using older versions of building codes, and some of them adopt parts of newer building codes. And plus, there's a whole range of building codes. There's the commercial and residential building codes. There are also energy codes, plumbing codes, fire codes, a whole bunch that any project is going to fall under. So all of these might be using building codes from different years. So you kind of have to figure that out ahead of time. And if they're not displaying that information on their website, then good to have a connection, I suppose, at the building department that you can ask questions to. And worst case scenario is you go through the process of submitting plans to a building department, and they come back and you have to add more information and make revisions. That sometimes happens too, where you just wait for their feedback and then you make revisions based on what they're looking for. It's always a different experience working with different building departments. So until you have experience working with any specific one, they're going to be different county by county, city by city.
So let's say you go to a new area, you're not going to like download and read all the codes, right? Like, because those documents are absolutely huge, right? Okay.
Yeah, and the changes that happen every 3 years is when codes are updated, but most jurisdictions don't immediately adopt them. They could take them a couple of years to adopt or even longer. It's good to have a grasp on any kind of new major changes to the building code. And, there's continuing education classes and things like that. There are ways to kind of keep in touch with like what's changing in the building code. One of the biggest things that's constantly changing and constantly becoming more strict is going to be energy codes. In our work where we're trying to design and build far above code minimum, it doesn't necessarily affect us, a whole lot, because we're always trying to go above and beyond. But for other builders who are building, or designers who are designing and building to code minimum, that's one of the biggest changes that's going to affect them when building code updates take place.
Now, do you need to know the code relating to things like electrical and plumbing, or is that somebody else's department?
You need to have a grasp of it for sure. Architects often do electrical drawings where they're laying out light switches and outlets and light fixtures. So you need to know things like electrical outlets, every kind of 12 feet in a room. You need to know that outlets next to a sink or a water source need to be GFCI. You need to know things like that because those are going to show up on your drawing. But ultimately, electricians and plumbers are the ones who really need to know their codes because they're in the field of installing it. So there's kind of like a baseline of information that needs to be on the electrical drawing, and architects need to know that those kind of more general rules. I'm usually not calling out, at least for smaller projects and residential projects, usually not calling out like specific slopes on a drain and, a shower drain or something like that. Whereas a plumber in the field needs to know the slope of a shower drain and the size of a shower drain and things like that. You don't need to know as much as the plumbers and the electricians, but you need to know enough that you're not creating an impossible situation for the people in the field building it.